Welcome back to the Flyin Miata garage. I'm Mike, and in this video we're going to be covering the preparation work and disassembly for our Stage 1 turbo kit install on our NB. Now, before we get started with actually doing anything with the car, we need to have a real talk. Now, with these systems, of course, you're adding significant horsepower to the car, so there's a few things that you need to check off before you really get started. Now, the first thing is that this is a turbocharger that was never intended to be fit on this car from the factory, so you are going to be doing some things to be able to make it work that Mazda didn't make accommodations for on the car. Now, I know it's exciting to go ahead and start putting the turbo parts on your car, but beforehand, another important thing to remember is that if you don't have all of your maintenance up to date, adding this much horsepower is likely just going to make it that much worse. So before you get started putting parts on your car, check, is your timing belt needing to be replaced? Is your water pump getting worn out? Do you need to replace any hoses or belts? Anything like that? Engine oil leaks? Do that now before the turbo kit, because they likely will get worse and can be made worse by the turbo kit because of the additional power. So take care of those things in advance before you start the turbo kit assembly. When you add a turbocharger, you also are going to be upgrading to high octane fuel. We recommend 91 octane as the minimum to give you more knock resistance. So before you even do anything, take any parts off, put any parts on, make sure that you run at least 2 fuel tanks worth of high octane fuel through the car. That way, by the time that you get the turbo on there, you're ready to go. Also, once you're ready to start putting parts on the car, it's a good idea to take inventory of what you have. So check through your kit, make sure you have all your parts. If you don't, give us a call, let us know. We'll be happy to help you out and make it right. Now, with the Stage 1 turbo kit, we do have installation instructions included, and this is something that we highly recommend that you read before you get started doing anything to your Miata. While we will be covering the installation process for a Stage 1 turbo kit on an NA or NB Miata, this video series is not a replacement or a substitute for the installation instructions. Please make sure that you keep these installation instructions on hand as you go throughout each step and progress throughout the build. They're going to have a lot more information, and you're always going to be able to refer back to them throughout the process. Now, it's important because we want you to be familiar with the process of how everything happens when you're doing the installation, but also we want you to be honest with yourself and your skill set. Do you have the mechanical skills? Do you have the tools required to be able to do this job? If not, it might be a good idea to talk with a local shop or possibly invite a mechanically minded friend with tools to come over and help you out along the way. Of course, if you need any help, if you have any comments or concerns, give us a call, send us an email. Our customer support representatives have done many of these kits. They're very familiar with the parts, so we can likely help you out if you run into any problems. A word of caution about the turbocharger. While it is a very sexy piece of machinery and we understand the appeal, while it's okay to spin the blades of the turbo by hand just to see them in action, do not use compressed air or any other kind of method that will spin the blades quickly. The reason being is that these turbochargers are shipped dry. They don't have any oil in the bearings. So if you overspin the blades, it'll spin the shaft and in turn the bearings, and you'll wear them out before you even get the turbo on your car. So it's very important, don't overspin the turbo before you have oil hooked up to it and it's installed on the engine. This is not something that can be warranted. This is a user error, so be very cautious about your turbocharger. We are finally ready to get started. So this installation video is going to be taking place on our NB Miata. We will try to cover the differences between the different NAs and NB Miatas while we go throughout the installation process. We'll call out the differences as we go along. But now we're ready to actually get the car up in the air and start turning wrenches. So first things first, we need to be able to get the car, jack it up in the air. We need to drain some fluids, we need to disconnect the battery, and we'll need to take off the front wheels. First things first, I like to undo the battery terminals just to make sure that there isn't a surprise later on down the road that you'll regret. On NBs, you'll simply remove some of the carpet and a little tray, and your battery is down here in the corner. On the NA Miatas, the battery is actually sitting right about here, and you may need to be able to get access to it, you may need to be able to remove the spare tire. A lot of times you can get around it without doing that though. So whatever is easiest for you, make it so. Generally speaking, I like to remove the negative battery terminal. So this just has a couple of nuts on each terminal, and these are 10mm nuts. So loosen it up just enough to be able to get it off like that. And then I'm just going to store that terminal down away from the battery. Before we jack the car up in the air, I'm going to take off the front wheels and tires to give us more access to the under tray and other areas right here up at the front of the car on the bottom. So right now, before I jack up the car, I'm just loosening the lug nuts. And then up she goes. Make sure, of course, that if you're using a lift, that you've got the feet firmly attached on the bottom side of the car. If you're using a floor jack and jack stands, make sure that you are using the lift points that are right behind the front wheels and right in front of the rear wheels. They're a section of the pinch weld that just has a little bit of a cutout to it. So here we go. All right, now that we have the wheels off, I'm going to go ahead and get the fluids drained. So to start off, I like to make sure that the engine is cool, or at least cool enough that you'll be able to get access to this. Take the oil cap off so that way it drains a little better, as well as, again, making sure this is cool, taking off the radiator cap because we will be draining the coolant. To gain better access to the underside of the engine bay, this plastic under tray needs to be taken off. There's a few bolts that hold it in place. You can see a couple here. There's also a nut that's up in here. And then we've got 3 screws across the front. So overall pretty easy. They're all 10mm heads, unless you've had to replace your hardware with something different. But I'll go ahead and take this part off now. That way we can get to the bottom side of the engine and the radiator. So NB2s in particular have these extra splash trays. On the NAs and NB1s, you don't have these extra splash shields. So in this case, to be able to get access to that last nut that holds on the under tray, I'm going to have to peel this bottom corner of the splash shield up and out of the way. So on the bottom here, it's just 3 little screws, and they are little M8s, or you can use a Phillips screwdriver like what I'm doing. So now I have easy access to that nut. Okay. So now the only thing that's holding this in here is that the plastic under tray has some tabs. You just pull it out around the sway bar and around the tie rods. So this side is loose. Same thing on this side. I'm simply going around the tie rod, pulling it around the sway bar, and a little bit of wiggling is sometimes required, and then it comes right out. So this is your under tray, and this one's dirty, but it's in okay shape. We'll still be able to reuse this for the turbo build whenever we trim it a little bit for the intercooler pipes. So first up, we're going to be draining the engine coolant. So this particular car has an aftermarket radiator. It's one of our cross-flow radiators. On this particular model, you can see that it doesn't have the drain plug like it would on the stock radiator. This one actually has the drain plug here in the mounting boss. So there's a little Allen plug, and I'll just pop that guy out and drain the coolant. and sometimes it's a mess like that. So on some radiators, you don't have a very quick drain. And on this particular instance, since we're installing a new radiator hose anyway, I'm also going to take off the clamp on the lower radiator hose here and allow this to drain out a little bit quicker. And it'll also undo that one side for me, which I'll need to take off anyway. There we go. So now that I've wiggled that guy off of there, the next trick is getting the hose loose and hopefully not spraying me right in the face. There we go. And there you go. Lots of coolant all at once. Be prepared with some rags and a bucket to catch it all in, because you'll likely make a bit of a mess. Alright, now that we've got the coolant drained, we're going to do the engine oil next. So we'll need to undo the plug down at the bottom of the pan. We'll also need to take out the oil filter as well. This is optional if you want to do the oil filter at the same time. I would certainly recommend it, because at this point you're essentially doing an oil change anyway. So I would put on a new filter at the same time. So this oil drain plug on NAs and NBs is either going to be a 14mm or a 17mm socket or wrench. On this particular one, it's a 17, so that's what we're going to do to take this off. Usually they are going to be a little bit on the tight side. This one wasn't too bad. So get it loose, get your bucket in place, and hopefully I don't drop this one like I did the radiator plug. Alright, so on this one I'm going to go ahead and take out the oil filter. This is a good time to do an oil change, of course, for the turbo, but also to change out your filter. So the easiest way I generally get to them is through this little access hole in the wheel well. We've already taken off the wheels and tires, so it's easy to get to. You can also get to it a little bit from the front and even sometimes from the top. If you take off, there's a bracket on the intake manifold. I'm just going to do it from the bottom. Just like that. Alright, now that the oil and the coolant have both been drained out of the engine, I went ahead, I didn't show you on camera, but I did put the drain plug back in, as well as added a new filter, oil filter. I went ahead and also put the drain plug back in the radiator. Everything was drained out, so to keep it from dribbling a little bit on the floor, everything got plugged back up. So now we're back on the top side, and the next job is to start taking off some of the intake bits. Before we do that though, I'm going to use some PB Blaster. You can use WD-40 or any other kind of effective penetrant, and I'm going to spray parts of the the exhaust manifold. There's a heat shield on it, as well as a couple of bolts that I can see. And this is something that, if you're thinking about it ahead of time, would be ideal to spray it maybe a day or two in advance if you can. These bolts, especially on the older cars, are going to be very rusty. This particular car is actually in pretty good shape, so we'll probably be able to get by without the step if we really needed to. But this is probably going to save you some headache, especially if you live on the coast or have an older vehicle. And some of these are in kind of an awkward position. If you got penetrant with a straw, that'll help you out quite a bit. So we're going to call that good. There's another couple down there, but this car is pretty clean, so I don't think that we're going to have to worry about it too much. So we'll let that sit while we're working on the intake bits. So right now, basically what we're going to do is take off all of the airbox and crossover tube, because this won't be used on the new turbo kit. This is all going to be replaced. So this is all basically held in place with a couple of bolts and nuts. There's a couple of clamps here too, and then there's some electrical system here that we'll want to disconnect before we take everything out. So that's what I'm going to do first. This is your mass airflow sensor. This is pretty much the same shape for all of the 1.8 liter engines. The 1.6 liter engines, they have what's called an airflow meter. It's a big box kind of thing that's got a swinging gate in it. It also will have a large plug, similar to this, a little bit wider, that's coming out of that guy. Be very careful with those. Any of these sensors are sensitive as far as you don't want to bang them around You don't want to get them, the actual internals of them wet or anything like that. So just be careful when you're taking these out. I'm going to unplug this guy just to get the harness out of the way. Over here on this side, this is the intake air temperature sensor for the NBs in particular. NAs don't have this particular sensor. So this one, I'm actually going to simply pull it out of its little rubber grommet. There we go. And then this little rubber grommet I'm also going to take with it. So you can kind of just squeeze it. It may help to use some pliers or a screwdriver, but I just pried the grommet out of there because we'll reuse that guy. So keep this off to the side. Now I'm going to use some pliers because there's a few retainers in here, and simply take off the wiring harness, or unsnip the wiring harness, so that way it's not attached to the airbox anymore. And these are just little push style retainer clips, so I'm just squeezing them together, that way they come right out. I'll lay this across the engine just to keep it out of the way for right now. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take off this crossover pipe. It just has a couple of clamps here and here, and you can use a Phillips screwdriver. This is pretty much the same on NAs and NBs. It looks a little different for some of the models, but it's the same kind of concept. We're just loosening these clamps. They're also, I believe, 10mm socket heads, so if you wanted to use a socket or a wrench, you could do that too. And then once you have those loose enough, just work one side off at a time. There you go. So this comes off. You also will have this hose that's going to the valve cover. This is a breather hose for the PCV system. So on the NBs, it's simple enough. You just pull the hose off and you're done. You've got your crossover pipe, and this just comes right off. So this can be put to the side. We won't be using this anymore. And now this PCV pipe, this on NAs is actually a metal pipe. On some of the earlier ones, you've got a metal pipe that comes around with a little bit of rubber on the end. And this guy is going to be replaced altogether. So on the NBs, you simply unclip it here, and then unclip that here, and it pulls right off. On NAs, it's kind of the same thing, only a little bit different because of the metal tube. Here's a little trick. If you need, this rubber hose is a little bit stuck, you can use pliers if you're really careful and just kind of twist the rubber, and that'll help break it free, and then it'll pull right off. There we go. So that's out of the way. Okay, so now what's left is just the actual air box. So on the NBs on this model, it's just a couple of bolts and some nuts. These are a combination of, looks like 10mm and 12mm nuts and bolts. So we'll go through and just unbolt these guys. So I'm just using a wrench, or excuse me, a ratchet with a socket and an extension. And by the way, if you don't want to have to fight around your hood prop like I am, we have some really nifty pneumatic hood struts that will get this guy out of here, and you don't have to work around it and fight it all the time. All right, so we've got two of the main attachment fasteners. There's another smaller one right here. And now the whole airbox just lifts up and out. So very easy on the NBs. NAs will be a slightly different design, especially the 1.6s again, but it's all pretty much the same theory. You're unbolting the airbox from the car. You're just making room. So a couple of sockets and wrenches or screwdrivers will do the job without too much worry. So this gets set off to the side. Now that the airbox and the crossover tube are out of the way, if you have an NA Miata, they do have an extra little bracket that's down here on the frame rail that basically has a little retainer with a stud that's poking up that holds the airbox in place. This is the NB version, of course, so it doesn't look the same. Check out our installation instructions for a picture of the NA version of that bracket. You'll need to take it out of there because it does get in the way of the turbo and the intake plumbing that goes to the air filter. Also on NAs at this time, you'll need to relocate your cruise control. The NB ones, since they're over here in this location, are fine. The NA ones are a little bit different, so you'll have to at least remove it, unbolt it from the fender, and set it off to the side because that'll need to be relocated. Now everything for the intake is taken off here. The next step is to take off the exhaust manifold heat shield, and then we'll start taking off the nuts for the exhaust manifold itself. Now this is important. It's not going to affect how much horsepower you do, but you'll kick yourself later if you don't. So before you do anything else, take out your dipstick. So a lot of people, and myself included, will probably accidentally break this off. It'll break off here at the top because you bump it or something else happens. You drop a wrench and it hits it or something like that. They are fragile, so I do recommend taking this out. If you want to plug that with a piece of towel or a rag, that's not a bad idea. But this is just to safeguard and prevent you from making a mistake later on. Now we want to take off the heat shield. So this heat shield has I think 6, 7, 8 or so bolts that are 10mm heads like this. This one's in pretty good shape, so we shouldn't have much trouble taking the bolts off. But we want this heat shield off first, so let's get on to that. So this one is a little nut. There's also one on the other side of the manifold, so you'll need to do that one too. And then last one. Okay, now that we've gotten all the ones from the top that you can see in the sides, there's one final one down here at the very, very bottom. You can just see it here at the end of my finger. So this little guy is tough to reach. Socket and the right extensions will probably do it. I like to use a little short stubby wrench. So let's go ahead and we'll get this guy off and take off this heat shield. Okay, last one. And this heat shield, with a little bit of persuasion, will come right out. So as you can see, each one of these little guys is just a retainer, that's all. And this won't be reused, so this can go off to the side. All right, now that the heat shield is off, before we take off the exhaust manifold, there's a couple more things we need to do first. So there is an EGR pipe on all 1.8 liter engines that this will need to come off. So you can see back here in the back. There's also a oxygen sensor down at the very bottom. You can just barely see it down at the bottom where the collector then turns into the mid pipe on the NBs. There'll be a similar style bung on the NAs. We need to get that out of there though, that way we can remove the exhaust. So let's go ahead and we'll spray some penetrant on there and get that taken care of. Now that we have penetrant soaking through on the threads for the oxygen sensor and the EGR pipe, we are going to bend the water bypass tube that's right there behind the exhaust manifold going up to the firewall. So as you can see, we've got two heater core hoses. This one is the one we're concerned about, and we're talking about where it meets this metal tube down here. So normally on this particular setup with a stock manifold it's fine, but with our turbo and the outlet it needs to be moved further back. So I'm going to take this big pry bar here, and I like to put it between this little piece, this little bracket that held on the heat shield, and then use that to pry against the hose, and you're just pushing backwards on it. We're just going straight back, and you don't have to do a whole bunch. We're just looking to gain a little bit of clearance. Ideally a little bit more, maybe like a couple, finger and a half, 2 fingers worth of clearance between the hose and then this part of the frame rail. Now we just need to take off the extra stuff, the EGR pipe and the oxygen sensor, so that way we can take off the manifold next. So on these guys, we've already sprayed penetrant on this EGR nut. In this case, some of them have a nut, some of them have a bolt actually that threads into the manifold itself. So on this one, it's a 22mm hex, so I'm just using a wrench. These will likely be very stuck, so you may need to get creative as far as getting leverage on it. But they simply loosen up once you've got them broken loose. Now that that nut is off, all we're doing now is just, I shoved it out of the way so that way it's loose. The two tubes that it's connected they're still touching, but that's okay. There's another couple of bolts on the intake manifold that we'll take off next, so that way we can take that pipe out altogether. This is the back of the intake manifold, and as you can see, there's a lot going on back there, and space is tight. But what we're interested in is the other end of that EGR pipe, and you can just see it here, kind of in the left-hand side of your screen, and there are two nuts that are retaining that pipe, holding it to the intake manifold. So there's this guy here, and then there's one on the other side. After you get those two nuts off of that EGR pipe, there is a P-clamp on the back of the head, and that P-clamp just is a retainer for that EGR pipe. It does have another 10mm head. You can't see it in this shot because space is so tight, so you kind of have to feel by braille to get it out of. Usually a open-ended wrench is the best way to get at it, but you'll just have to follow the EGR pipe back along the back side of the head, and you'll find that P-clamp with the 10mm, and just take that out. After you've done that, that pipe will be able to be slid out from either left or right side, just depending on how it works out easier for you. Space is really tight on the back of the head. NAs especially will have a hard time reaching this because you have a coil pack set and you also have a cam angle sensor hanging off the back of the head. On this NB, you can just make out that little 10mm bolt that has the retaining P-clip for the EGR tube. So I'm going to reach back there with a 10mm open-end wrench and loosen that guy up. So now, this EGR tube should be able to come out. There we go. Next step now is to remove the oxygen sensor. So we've already sprayed it down with PB Blaster. Now I just need to break it loose. Before I do anything though with the sensor itself, I'm actually going to unplug it. That way the wire is free to spin and rotate. So on these models, this is the connector for the oxygen sensor up here. So I will simply unplug it, just like that. And then it has a little clip on the bottom here. It pokes through. And you'll need some needle nose pliers probably to be able to get that off of there. Just like that. There's a couple other clips on the back of the head that are hard to see, so I went ahead and unplugged them, but basically now this is all free. You can access it, and I'm just going to pull it here down out of the way. That way I can get the sensor pulled out. There we go. So the oxygen sensors, the hexes on these guys, they are a 22mm, just like the EGR nut that was on this manifold. So same thing, it's been sprayed down, so break this loose, and then I will reach through the wheel well. This is an easy way to access it. And when you pull this sensor out, be very careful not to drop it. You will be reusing this. So at this time, if you pull it out of here, and this one looks okay, you can see it's a little bit wet from the PB Blaster, the penetrant, but you can see that it's overall in good shape. If yours is really, really black, or if yours is really, really white, that could be indications of either you are having misfire problems or some other kind of engine fueling issue or ignition issue that is causing you to the engine to run overly lean or overly rich. So if that's the case, you may want to look more into seeing what that problem is and get it taken care of, because it's only going to get worse when you add boost. PB Blaster or WD-40 again, and you're going to spray off these head studs. Now that we have the exhaust manifold heat shield off and we've sprayed down the nuts that hold the manifold to the head with penetrating oil, it's time to take those guys off. So they're all 14mm head nuts, 1/6, 1/8, and A and B. They're all the same. There's 9 of them, so you'll kind of need to attack them each at a different position and from different angles. So I like to use a combination of a ratchet with a 14mm deep socket, as well as an open end and closed end wrench, again 14mm. So just use different methods to attack these different placements for each one of these nuts. So let's go ahead and we'll take these off. Okay, now that I've broken them loose, I like to use just an impact gun, or if you have any kind of pneumatic tool, this will save you a lot of time, on most of them any way that you can reach. And for these last 3 nuts that I can't really get to very easily with the electric impact, I'm just going to use my ratchet and the wrench. So I'll go ahead and get these whipped off here. Now that all of the manifold nuts and the EGR pipe and the O2 sensor are out of the exhaust manifold, now we need to take off the bottom portion so that way we can pull it all out of here. So in order to do that, you need to take off any under-car bracing. So on these cars, there's going to usually be a brace right here that connects the back end of the front subframe. Some of the early cars don't have that. Also, on some of the latter years, there are going to be more braces back here. This one has it removed. You can see it actually has our frame rails on this car. But as far as this section right here, we basically want to get anything from this flange to the bell housing, essentially, any of those braces out of here. So right now, just this one needs to come out. Also, other than that, we need to loosen these nuts. That way we can have this flange come apart. And then if you look right up here, we also have this bracket that attaches the downpipe section of the factory exhaust to the bell housing of the transmission. There's 2 bolts that hold that on, so those will need to come out as well. If you've never been under a car before undoing these bolts that have probably never come off in the past, likely they're going to have a lot of crud on them. So we definitely recommend wearing at least eye protection, possibly ear protection if you're going to be using any kind of impact tool. But be careful looking up, because you'll likely get crud dropped in your eyes if you're not wearing some kind of protection. So these 2 bell housing bolts, you kind of need to be able to get to them at a strange angle. So usually I use a bunch of wobble extensions or wobble sockets, universals. If you have them, impact stuff works great, because these will probably be very loose unless you've been in here replacing your clutch recently, which you should have if you haven't already, because this turbo system definitely will require an upgraded clutch. So now's kind of a good time to do that at the same time. So, but these are 17mm head bolts. So we're going to zip these 2 out, that way we can take this bracket off. All right. So these are different length bolts. So you do need to make sure that you keep them lined up with which hole that they came out of. Now that you have the 2 bolts that are holding the bracket to the bell housing taken out, then the last thing you have to do is this bracket. So if you try to take it out right now, you'll likely have problems getting this bracket past the bell housing or you'll have problems after that getting this 3-bolt flange past the steering rack. So this bracket needs to come off altogether to give yourself a better chance at getting all of this out from the top. So now be careful. You can see on this side it's already been chewed up. That's because that nut doesn't come off. It's a weld nut. So there's a bolt on the other side. This is a pinch style clamp. So you need to take out this bolt, not the nut. You'll be fighting the nut for a long time before you realize that that doesn't come off. So we're going to take this bolt off. That way we can pull the bracket off the exhaust. All right. So just like that, that bracket will just fall out of place, so be careful that your face is not right there underneath it. Now that that bracket is out of the way, your 2 bell housing bolts need to go back in. So remember, you've got a shorter one, there you go, shorter one and a longer one. So the shorter one goes in the bottom, and then the longer one goes up top. And you'll know that this is correct because they'll both stick out from the bell housing about the same length. Now I'm just going to zip them in. Then I'll torque these down and we're good to go. And lastly, we're going to take apart this flange. You can see there are 2 nuts, one on this side and one on the side. They connect the downpipe portion of the factory exhaust manifold to the mid pipe, and you can see this is the factory catalytic converter. NAs will look a little bit different, but it's much the same story. You'll have a flange right about here at the end of your transmission that you'll need to take apart. So these again are also 17mm nuts. And now the exhaust is ready to come out from above. Final step before you take out the exhaust here is that on NBs in particular, and probably some of the NAs, you'll likely need to loosen up. There's a bolt that holds this dipstick tube in place. See, right now it's rigid, it won't move, and you'll foul on the EGR pipe. So to be able to allow you some movement, there's a bolt here. It's really tight. I'll attempt to stick my finger down there to point at it. Just on the other side of where this ground strap is, there's a nut rather that's holding those 2 things, the strap and this tube, in place. So I'll take that nut off, that way we can move the tube around a little bit to give us some clearance. All right, so now that this little nut is off, this dipstick tube can now move around a little bit, so you've got some freedom. If you want to, you can even pull it up and out of there. There's a little O-ring at the bottom. A lot of times they're going to be hard, so you may not want to do that because it may not seal very well whenever you put it back in, but you do have the option. The O-rings are pretty easy to replace. Now that all of the auxiliary parts like the EGR tube, the oxygen sensor, and the bolts down at the mid-pipe have been removed, we can finally take out the factory exhaust header. So I'll go ahead and pull this guy out now from the top. This will be the easiest way to get it. So you can see on this, I've actually taken apart, it's a 2-piece downpipe and header arrangement from the factory. So this would have been connected like this. You can take it all out as one piece if you want. On some of the cars, you may have a little bit less room because of the way the flange is oriented in the car. So if you get stuck trying to clear the steering column that's coming down through there right next to, you can see it right here, right next to the exhaust, if you're having trouble clearing that, you can simply take off the 3 nuts that hold this upper section of the factory exhaust manifold to the lower section. Take those off and that'll make the job a lot easier. Of course, if you have no intentions of reusing or trying to sell off these parts, a Sawzall also will do the job just fine if the nuts are quite rusty, which in a lot of cases they can be. Now that the exhaust manifold is taken out of the engine bay, the first thing we want to do is just make sure that we don't accidentally drop anything in there. There's no dust particles that might work their way in there, or any metal shavings, because we will be cutting the frame rail. So what I'm going to do is just take some rolled rags and shove them in the exhaust ports, don't have to do anything fancy here. We're just making sure that stuff doesn't accidentally fall in there. And that's it. At this point also, you can go ahead and remove this gasket if you haven't already. There's a new one included with your kit, so you don't need to reuse this one. This can go in the trash. Now that the exhaust manifold is out of there, we can finally do the slotting of the frame rail. So on this particular application with our manifold, you do need to make a little bit more room right here. You can see that I've already marked it out, these two lines that we'll need to cut in the frame rail. The reason being is that the compressor housing is going to sit right here, and so to avoid knocking the frame rail with the compressor housing when the engine shifts over a little bit, when you're revving the engine, or if you're doing any kind of shifting that's aggressive, you'll get a little bit of engine movement. So to avoid any contact here, this needs to be slotted so that way we can then bend this flap down, give us a little bit more clearance. So you can see that I've already marked out the cut locations. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a measurement here from the inside of this shock tower, and I measured an inch here, and then again I measured from the inside to 3 1/4 inches and made this mark. So all we're looking to do is cut these slots even to where you start, that you finish up right at the box section of the frame rail, and then this is just going to fold down flat against that box. So the tool that I'm going to be using is a hacksaw. Now, if you have a rotary tool, or if you have some kind of a power tool to be able to do this job, that's perfectly fine. I figured that most people are going to have access to this tool rather than not everybody's going to have access to power tools or air tools all the time. So I thought we'd go ahead and just show off that this is a perfectly acceptable tool to do this job. Before you start cutting the frame rail though, you need to make sure that everything's out of the way as far as hoses and electrical is concerned. So on this particular car, you can see there are a few hoses down here. This one is the power steering hose going down to the steering rack, so we'll need to move this one. And also just to get a little bit more excess, this is the lower radiator hose, the return back to the water pump in the engine block. So this will need to be removed anyway. So to gain us a little bit more room, let's go ahead and we'll do that now. So these ones also have just a squeezy style clamp from the factory. So move this clamp back far enough to where you can get the hose off of there. If you encounter a stuck radiator hose like this one, a handy tool to use is a hose hook. So there's a lot of different shapes. This one is really well shaped for this particular application because I can reach around and slide it underneath the hose like this, and I can work it all the way around to basically break the slight seal that it's made around that aluminum piece. So now that I've broken the seal on the inside, it'll come off a lot more easily. And now we have this out of here. So it also has a clamp down here. NBs, this is all one hose. NAs, there's actually two sections. There's a hard, basically hose connection down here that this hose will have a short run down to this little connector, and then another small hose that goes down to the radiator. On MBs, it's all one hose, and then there's a plastic clip right there. So this plastic clip, you can take it apart. Here, just to move this out of the way, you can see that it's a two-piece. It's got this little upper clamp for the power steering hose, then it has a big clamp on the lower radiator hose. And basically, you have to pull it apart. There's kind of a double locking jaw in there between the two of them. I'm just using a flat blade screwdriver here. And once you are able to undo that little clamp, just interlocking jaws. There we go. So you can see here that it's opened up. Once it's been opened up, you can simply pull that hose through. And you can do it from the top or the bottom, whichever way works for you. Looks like on this one I'm actually going to try to push it out. Nope, pull it out through the top. There we go. So this will not be reused, so you can set this off to the side or put it in the trash can. You don't need it for the turbo kit install. We're left with one more hose, this power steering hose. So we want to keep this one. So just to keep it out of the way, what we're going to do is zip tie it. So there's a few zip ties that are included with the kit. So if you want to, you can use the zip ties included, or if you've got a few extra, all I'm going to do is just run it up here and zip tie it temporarily, just to keep it out of the way. Now, for these lines, I've got a pretty clear shot for both of them. So now, all we're going to do is just follow these marks, and we're just going to cut about 5/8 of an inch, basically to where you're hitting that rail, or just about touching the box section of the frame rail, and then we'll fold it down. Okay, so now that we have the slots cut right here, I can feel on the bottom that they go all the way just about to the box section of the frame rail. So we're good to go. If you have a shop vac, you might want to vacuum up some of the little metal shavings here. Otherwise, just be careful that you don't get it into any kind of fluid. If you've got a coolant catch bucket on the ground or something underneath the car. But now, simply, we just need to bend this little flap down. It's going to use a fine adjustment tool. We're going to massage that metal down out of the way. Now, of course, put on your safety glasses just in case. Now, of course, you don't want to hit your valve cover, so start slow, and you're just looking to bend this down flat, as flush as you can get it. Okay, so that's all we're looking to achieve. Just make sure that this is flush, flat down against that box section. So all it is, just a little flap folded over. Now, of course, you see these sharp corners and it's a rough edge. So what we're going to do next is take a file and just kind of round everything over. That way you're less likely to cut your hand open whenever you're reaching around in the engine bay. So what I'm going to do is use just a long flat file like this. This is probably going to be the best way to take care of those edges. You can also use sandpaper, although you'll probably be here a little bit while longer. But let's go ahead and see if we can get this cleaned up a little bit. Okay, so we're not looking for anything fancy there, just looking for something that, again, you're not going to get yourself cut up on. You're welcome to do as much or whatever you feel is good enough here, as long as it's safe. Once you're done, if you have any touch-up paint, you can go ahead and clean this all up, use some degreaser and spray a little bit of touch-up paint in here. That way it looks as factory as possible. If you don't have touch-up paint or don't have any handy and you need to get this in, another thing you can do is clean it up, use a little bit of degreaser, and then just apply a little bit of nail polish, clear nail polish, or even colored nail polish if you want, just to protect these bare metal surfaces that are on here now that we've been cutting away and hammering and filing. So just to protect this from rust further on down the road. It doesn't have to be anything super pretty, because once you put the turbo in there, you're not really going to see much of that anyway. So we're really just looking for rust protection. The lower radiator hose is out of the way, and on NBs we still have that bracket, that little plastic guy here that's hanging on to the frame rail. Now this is going to be right where the compressor hose going from the turbo down to the intercooler is going to live, so we can't have this anymore. NAs, you're going to have a little bracket here that's basically the in-betweener piece, since it's a two-piece lower radiator hose, and that's got a couple of bolts on it, so you'll need to take that off. NB owners, you simply need a screwdriver or a trim removal tool like this. And we're just going to pop that guy out. And it won't be reused. So that's done. Last thing that I'm going to do here is just cut off this little zip tie and let this power steering hose back down into its normal position, because we'll still want to retain power steering, of course. So this guy's going to live right there, and then our hose for the compressor outlet's going to go right down there underneath it. Now that we've got the exhaust out of there and we've got the frame rail cut, all the initial disassembly and prep has been taken care of. So now we're ready to move on to the next step. Stay tuned for our next video, where we are going to be drilling the oil pan and doing other prep work for the lines going to the turbo. Thanks again for watching. If you have any questions, any comments, feel free to give us a comment here in the video, or give us a call or send us an email. We'll be back soon. Thanks.